Happy Wednesday, Blazers. Mr. O'Brien here. Alright, my friends, please get out your notebook and open up to the very first page. On the very first page, we have some notes about how to send emails and some bell work. Well, today, I want you to open to that first page. Maybe you're on page 2 now. Maybe you filled all the way to the bottom. And I want you to write Wednesday, 9/9. That's today's date. And I want you to number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. I've got a couple short passages, and I want you to tell me what point of view the story is told in. Okay? So I'm going to read the passage to you, and then I'm going to model for you how I, a master at figuring out point of view, how I determine the point of view. All right? And so I want you to follow my process. Okay? So I'm going to model it for you. So first, I read the story. The farmhand scratched his head and said, "So you haven't seen a giant chicken around here, have you?" I looked into his eyes to see if he was putting me on. He seemed sincere. "How big is she?" I asked. The farmhand pointed at the large SUV and said, "Oh, he's about yay big." Okay, so when I'm trying to figure out point of view, the first question I ask, is an I telling the story or is it a narrator? So is it a character that says, I did this, I said that, I feel like this? Or is it a narrator telling the story? Phil felt this way. He said this. Well, in this case, we can tell right here. I looked into his eyes. I asked. The I is telling the story. There is a character who says, I did this, I asked that. The I is telling the story. So this must be first person. Let's move on. Number 2. This story is told in a different point of view. Let's see if you can figure out what it is. Now, Phil looked at the farmhand with disbelief and said, "You're telling me that you have a chicken as big as a truck? He's out of control and he's somewhere around here?" The farmhand nodded his head. That's when Phil heard the loudest clucking noise that he had ever heard. Phil felt his stomach drop as a cold panic raced down his spine. So once again, let's go through the steps. First question we ask, is it an I telling the story or is it a narrator? Do we have a character who says, I did this, I did that, I said this? We do not. In this story, we have Phil looked at the farmhand. Not I looked at the farmhand, right? Instead of saying I said, right, it's Phil said. So this is told by a narrator. The narrator is telling us what Phil is doing. It's not Phil telling us what he's doing. So the narrator tells us what Phil is doing. So we know that this is not told in first person because the I is not telling the story. So if it's a narrator, it has to be third person. But now we have to ask ourselves a second question. Do we hear one character's thoughts or do we hear several? Let's go back through. Phil, he looks with disbelief. He says this. Farmhand nods. That's when Phil hears this loud noise. Phil felt his stomach drop. Okay, so we hear Phil's thoughts. We hear his feelings, right? Phil felt his stomach drop. The narrator tells us how Phil feels. Okay, so we hear his thoughts. Do we hear anybody else's? Do we hear the farmhand's thoughts? No. So this is limited to one character's thoughts. So it's got a narrator, so it's third person, and the narrator only tells us Phil's thoughts. It's limited to one character, so it is third person limited. Okay, we're getting the hang of this. Let's see if you can do this one all on your own. Phil looked over to the farmhand where the farmhand was standing, but he had already taken off running. Phil felt totally exposed. "Why do chickens lay eggs?" Phil whirled around to see the SUV-sized chicken smirking, head held high, proudly, staring cockily. Phil knew this chicken was bad news. "Because if they dropped him, they'd break. Quack, 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 quack." The chicken guffawed. Do you get it? Why do chickens lay eggs? Because if they dropped them, they'd break. Quack, 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 quack. All right, do you remember the steps? First thing I ask myself, is an I telling the story, or is it a narrator? See if you can do this one. Do we have an I saying, I did this, I looked over here, I felt this way, I said this? No, we do not have a character telling their own story. So it must be told by a narrator. If it's told by a narrator, that means it's third person. So we need to double check, is there one character's thoughts? Or are there more than one character's thoughts or feelings? Phil felt totally exposed. So that is how Phil felt. Why do chickens lay eggs? The chicken smiles. Okay, so we can see what the chicken does. The narrator tells us what the chicken does, but we don't hear the chicken's thoughts. We don't hear how the chicken feels. Phil knew this chicken was bad news. So once again, we hear Phil's thoughts. We hear Phil's feelings. So we are limited to only one character's thoughts. So it's a narrator, which means this is told in the third person, but we're limited to only Phil's thoughts. So this would be third limited. Did you get that one right? Let's move on to number 4. Totally different story. All right. Dr. Brando examined the fusion reactor. He knew that one false move could cause the whole system to explode, so he worked carefully. Dr. Mannheim walked into the reactor room. Now, Dr. Mannheim was just out of college. He neither understood nor appreciated the pressure under which Dr. Brando was working. Dr. Mannheim snuck up behind Dr. Brando and said, "What up, Doc?" It was a terrible Bugs Bunny impression. Question number 1. Is an I telling the story, or is it a narrator? Do we have an I who says, I did this, I feel like this, I said this? No. We have a narrator telling us Dr. Brando did this. Dr. Mannheim did this. Okay, so it's told by a narrator, so we know then I is not telling the story, so it is not first person. It must be third. But there are 2 options for third person, limited and omniscient. So we ask ourselves, do I hear more than one character's thoughts? If I hear only one, it'd be limited. If I hear more than one, it would be omniscient. So Dr. Brando, he examines the reactor. He knew. Okay, so here we hear Dr. Brando's thoughts. We hear what he knows. So we hear one character's thoughts, Dr. Brando. Let's see if we hear Dr. Mannheim's thoughts or his feelings. Dr. Mannheim walks into the reactor room. He was just out of college. He did not understand or appreciate the pressure under which Dr. Brando was working. So right there, we hear Dr. Mannheim's thoughts. We get a glimpse into his mind, and we hear that he doesn't understand. He doesn't appreciate how much pressure Dr. Brando is under. So the narrator tells us 1, 2 characters' thoughts. It's not limited to one character. It's omniscient, all-knowing. So this would be third person omniscient. An omniscient narrator tells you more than one character's thoughts. Let's look at our last example. My mother always told me that I had an overactive imagination. But look at me now. I'm writing Hollywood movies for big budget studios. I drive a fancy red bicycle. So, first question we ask, is it an I telling the story, or is it a narrator? Do we have a character saying, I did this, I did that? In this case, yes. Right? We have a character telling us, I did this, I had an overactive imagination, I'm writing Hollywood movies, I drive a fancy red bicycle. The I is telling the story. So we don't even have to go to that next question. We only hear the I's thoughts. It must be first. Okay? If a character is telling their own story, I did this, I said this, I felt like this, then the I is telling the story. That would be first person. Very, very good. Okay. So today, we are going to take our stories from our brains and we're going to get them down onto paper. All right, so that is our goal today. We're going to do a little bit of writing. So now I want you to flip to later in your notebook, right? So right now you're at the beginning of your notebook. You're where your bell work is. I want you to go to your point of view page. Here are your notes from yesterday. From Mr. O, it's page 20. So I got my first person point of view, third person limited, third person omniscient. You can see my notes. You can see I even wrote examples because that is what a great student does. Great students do not settle for just writing down the definition. They also write down examples. So that way when they go back to review their notes, they have an example to practice with. Did you copy down any examples? Are you rewinding this video to write down an example of your own? Are you going to come up with one? Anywho, let's move on. So you should be on this page in your notebook, and I want you to go to the next page. I want you at the very top of your next page. For me, it's page 21. For you, it might be page 18. I don't know what page you're on, but it should be right after this point of view, right after your notes on point of view. And I want you to write at the very top, draft number 1. And I want you to write the words first person. Okay? Here is what you are going to do today. And in fact, I'm going to do it as well. Everything that I have you guys do, right, I also do myself. I don't know if you noticed this, but I don't just make you take notes. I also write down the notes. There is a reason that I have mastered these skills, and it's because I practice them. So make sure you are practicing. So, up at the top of your paper, write draft number 1 and jot down first person. What you're going to do today is you're going to begin writing your story in your lit notebook. You are not typing this out on a computer. You will begin writing your story in your lit notebook. You are not going to turn this in. You are not going to submit a picture. I am going to have you show me your notebook, and in fact, I'm going to collect your notebook during the first week of school. So I will actually see this in person, in physical copy, next week. So you are going to do this in your notebook. Your story, right? The story that you decided that you wanted to tell, you must tell it in the first person. All right, so today we're going to write it in the first person. And if you don't like how it sounds, that's okay. Tomorrow we're going to tell it in a different point of view. Okay? Now, you will not write your whole story today. You're going to write until you reveal the major conflict. I'm kind of ashamed. I shouldn't have said the word problem. I'm going to change that. Conflict. See, Mr. O'Brien makes mistakes all the time. You are going to write until you reveal the major conflict, the major problem in your story, and then stop. Do not, I mean it, do not write your whole story. Maybe I'm using reverse psychology, or maybe I'm just encouraging you not to get stressed out. I don't want you writing your whole story today. I want you to write your story until you reveal the main problem in your story, okay? Now, I'm going to model this for you. I'm going to show you, okay? Like I said, anytime I have you do something, I do it myself. So here's my story, all right? This is my story told in a certain point of view. Let's see if you can tell what it is. Why am I so exhausted? Sure, it's hot, but I've never felt this tired in all 47 days of my life. My friends, what's the point of view? You can tell already. Let's ask that first question. Is it an I telling the story, or is it a narrator? Do we have a character saying, I did this, I said this, I feel this way? We do, right? Why am I so exhausted? I've never felt this tired, so this is first person, which makes sense because, that's what we're doing today. We're writing a story in first person. So let's move on. Okay. Why am I so exhausted? Oh, sure, it's hot, but I've never felt this tired in all 47 days of my life. Rudy, look alive! Grandpappy called out. A small umbrella of shade crept across my face as Grandpappy's flower stalk stretched towards the sun. It was just a tiny bit of shade, but I had never felt so relieved in all my life. You already know, this is told in the first person. I'm going to keep going. Grandpappy, what's going on? I feel like my leaves are on fire, I asked.
Drought, I suspect. Haven't had a drop of the good stuff since you were a young carrot.
Grandpappy shook his head. Okay, so I am going to continue writing my story until Rudy gets the letter from the Zin, Zan, and Zinea, the Zinnia sisters. So I'm going to keep writing my story, okay? But this is exactly what I want you to do. I want you to start writing your story. I want it told in the first person, and I want you to write until you reach the conflict in your story. Okay, so that is your homework for today. In your notebook, you are going to write your story. You're going to write it in the first person. All right, so whatever story it is that you wrote to me in your form, you told me this is the story I want to write. I want you to start writing it. Okay, whoa. Start writing your story. It must be in the first person. That is how I'm going to grade you. Is the story actually in the first person or not? Okay, do not write the whole story. Just write until you get to the problem. Let your reader know what is the big problem and then stop. Okay? There's no length requirement. Maybe 1 page. I think if you did 1 whole page of writing, that would be great. If you do more than 1 page, look at you. You're getting better at writing. Okay? These are the requirements. Again, you are not turning in a picture of this. I am going to collect your notebooks during the first week of school, and I will see this in your notebook. All right. Please email me if you have any questions. Mr. O'Brien, out.